Haidt needs a little introduction, but just to give him a little introduction, he is a professor of social psychology at the Stern School at New York University, author of The Righteous Mind, very influential book on me and probably many others here, Coddling of the American Mind, and now the bestseller, The Anxious Generation. I'm very pleased to say that I've slightly known Jonathan for quite a few years. Indeed, he blurbed my last two books. And now that you're the world's most important public intellectual, I hope that I'll get some reflected glory from that. Your own book has leapt into the bestseller lists. I think you're on number 6. I'm afraid 2 places behind Liz Truss. So, but the important thing, obviously, your policy ideas, the overprotection of childhood in the real world and the underprotection online. You've been hugely influential, both in helping to create grassroots movements. I think we have one of the founders of the smartphone-free childhood movement here in the audience. And in the political class, there's a lot of interest at number 10. And of course, here at Policy Exchange, we're also today, as well as hearing from Jonathan, we're also launching a paper of our own on the case for smartphone ban in schools. Disconnect, indeed. I think we were just talking about this. I think one of the really exciting and positive things about what Jonathan has been doing is how these ideas are transcending the normal tribalism of modern politics. I wonder if you've considered running for president.
Worst job in America.
Anyway, the running order here is that Jonathan's going to speak with some slides for 20, 25 minutes. I'm then going to converse with him for 10 or 15, and then we'll throw it open to you guys for comments and questions. So thanks a lot. Over to you, Jonathan.
Thank you, David. All right. First, just a couple of organizational things. One is, first of all, I've been having vocal cord problems for a while. So this is the loudest I can speak. Are you able to hear me in the back? Okay. I don't know if you can make the amplification just maybe a little bit more. It just sounds to me like it's like okay. Great. And then, oh yeah, I think that feels a little better. Thank you. And second, I really want to show some data slides. Just tell me in the back. Can everybody see that monitor? Well, I guess you're not nodding, but okay. Okay, good. All right. So, you know, it's sometimes said that the 21st century will be the century of AI or robotics or genomics or all sorts of things. And it will be all of those in terms of technology, but I like to say the 21st century is really going to be the century of social science, because if we mess up, if we hit disaster, it's going to be because of the human element, that we weren't able to manage this or even understand what was happening to us. And so I think this is going to be the century of social science, and there's a good chance we're going to fail, because at least the universities are not producing good social science, or at least I should say there are so many restrictions and moral and political complexities that our most important social sciences, such as sociology, I think are not really contributing to the public dialogue on the matters that are most important. And that's why I'm very pleased to have this long association with Policy Exchange, with David. I think we met around 2012. Because I think this organization, it's so important to have multiple centers of intellectual effort. And I think that some of the things I see coming out of here, and especially this report, I think is just magnificent. So I'm very pleased to be here, and thank you for coming here today too. What I'm going to do is I want to just give you kind of a quick overview of the story that I tell in the book. Some of you have read the book. I hope I've been completely unavoidable, so some of you have seen me in some sort of a TV or podcast, something or other. But I worked out this sort of the story for Britain a little better on my way over here, and I have some slides about what's specifically happening in this country. So I want to begin, I'm an intuitionist, which means I believe we don't believe things because we see data and evidence. We first believe them, it feels right to us, and then we're more receptive to the evidence. So just a very simple anecdote. Just first the outline of what I'm saying today is a tragedy in 2 acts. It's a tragedy affecting all of the countries in the Anglosphere, America and Britain preeminently. And the two acts are, first, the play-based childhood faded out gradually, and that was really the subject of the Coddling the American Mind, a lot of that. And in that book, Greg and I noted, the timing is such that maybe smartphones had something to do with it too, and social media, that fits too, but we don't really know. And that was 2017 we were writing that. Well, now we know. And so Act 2 is the phone-based childhood comes sweeping in just 5 years, between 2010 and 2015, and changes childhood on a global level. The anecdote is just this, that the New York Times did a profile of me, and they tried to make me into this very controversial figure. But the thing I want to show you is the comments. In the New York Times, they still allow reader comments, and then the readers can upvote. What's the comment that that it gets the most support from other readers? And it was this one. Out of 800 comments or so, it was this one. I taught high school for 19 years. I left in 2022. Number one reason? The phones. Students enter class looking at their phones. They walk down the halls looking at their phones. They sit around the cafeteria and campus after school looking at their phones. It's only because the handheld digital onslaught occurred over several years that we don't see it for what it is. Now I teach at a middle school where students never have their phones available. The result? Eye contact, good cheer, lively conversation, laughter, playfulness, and a sense of camaraderie. I left the clouds behind, and now the sun is out again. I'm happy. I get emails like this almost every day from teachers. I have never even heard of a school that went phone-free and regretted it. I put out a call on Twitter. Can anyone find a school that tried this and had problem, or there were implementation difficulties, that's true, but a school that regretted it, can't find a single one. So let's understand the mess that we got ourselves into and why it is so vital that we make schools phone-free as quickly as possible. This is sort of the standard story I tell when I have like a full hour to talk and lay out the entire argument, which I'm not going to do today, but I do want to especially focus on part 1 and part 6 for today's discussion with David and with you. So first, just to show you the nature of what has happened, I'll start with American data and then show you the British data is exactly the same. So what this graph shows is the rates of various mental disorders as recorded by mental health centers at universities across the United States. And what we see, in all the slides I'll show you, what you'll see is that in the late 90s and through the 2000s, there were no trends. So these are levels of anxiety, depression on top, and there are no trends. They're not going up, they're not going down. Things were very stable, surprisingly, in the 2000s when the students were millennials, the millennial generation. Gen Z begins to arrive on campus around 2013, and this is what happens when they arrive. So levels of anxiety and depression skyrocket to the point where it's not just 10% of the students. We're now in the ballpark, if you combine the two, you're up in the 30s. Around 30, somewhere in the 30s is the percentage of students who have an anxiety disorder or depression. So it's rising very fast in a short period of time. It's not hitting all generations. Here we see the anxiety data. This is nationally representative data from a different survey, broken up by age group, and what you see is that the young people have the highest rates, but not by a lot, although now it's by a lot. So something happened to Gen Z, something happened to young people. Whatever happened in the 2010s, it didn't affect people over 50 at all. It didn't really affect people over 35. It affects the millennials a little bit, but it's really concentrated in Gen Z, which is birth year 1996 and later. And we usually see gender differences. Now here, these are the depression rates. Now here, the relative increase is actually in the same ballpark, but because girls have higher levels of internalizing disorders, especially anxiety, depression, that begins at puberty. And puberty is the crux of the story here. Because girls have higher rates, the absolute increase is gigantic. Another thing I want to point out about this graph is you can see the COVID effect. Do you see it? If you squint, you can see the effect of COVID. It did make things worse. But if you look at the long-term, it was really just a blip on a long-term trend line of acceleration that began right around 2012. Now, many critics have said, oh, this is just a moral panic. Gen Z is so comfortable talking about their mental health. We should applaud that. This is a good thing. They're willing to admit that they're depressed. It's not a real change in underlying depression, they say. Well, okay, reasonable argument. Let's look at behavior. Let's look at behavior that's not self-reported. So this is from the CDC, our best national health data. They track why people are going into hospitals because they want to be able to look out for sudden things emerging, new diseases. And one of the categories is not unintentional, non-suicidal self-injury. And what we see here are the rates for girls and boys. They were stable in the 2000s, and then this happens. So 188% increase for girls. We always find the largest increases in the younger teen girls, age 10 to 14. Something happened that really honed right in on them and caused them to start self-harming, taking overdoses of their psychiatric medications, and entering hospitals. It really hits the younger teen girls. And we see the same trend in suicide. So rates, again, were fairly stable in the early 2000s. And again, I'm focusing on the younger teens here, which is where we see the most dramatic effects. And then this happens. So these are not self-report. These are actual dead kids. It's important to note that suicide is mostly taking boys. This is true around the Western world. Girls make more attempts. But boys, when they make an attempt, they tend to use a gun, at least in my country, or a tall building. When a boy makes an attempt, he is much more likely to succeed in ending his life. So the rates are higher for boys. As you see, the percent increases are a little higher for girls, but it's the same ballpark. This is hitting both of our kids. And I just, if you saw in the paper today, about that sextortion ring that is taking in hundreds, thousands, actually tens of thousands of boys, and at least a dozen suicides are linked directly to that. So even if I seem to focus on girls, the boys' story is terrible. It's just not as sharp at 2012. It's a longer story, which I tell in chapter 7 of the book. All right, so you see the American pattern. British pattern is the same. My research partner, Zach Rausch, I said, Zach, go gather all the data you can from around the world. I'd started to do this with the Coddling the American Mind, but I said, here, Zach, you take on this project. I'm too busy. And he did a brilliant job. We started with the Anglo countries because that's where the data is generally very good. And so his first post, I hope you'll all subscribe to my Substack. It's free, afterbabel.com. This is where we put up our analyses and a lot of great writing. So what's happening in the Anglosphere? Well, here's the British data, self-harm. What happens? Stable rates until 2010, and then this happens. It's as though somebody flipped a switch in 2012 and your girls started cutting themselves and checking into psychiatric wards. And when we look at when we go younger teens, that's where you get the most extraordinary effects. Here's your 10 to 12-year-olds. They didn't used to cut themselves. Those are very low rates. I mean, again, to look at the axis, the older teen girls are in the ballpark, they were in the ballpark of 600 per 100,000. Whereas your younger teen girls, they were at like 80 per 100,000, so very low rates. But then it quadruples. More than that, actually, 364% increase in your girls in the 2010s, in your 10 to 12-year-old girls. It's not something preteen girls used to do. Now it is. We see the same thing in Australia. I could show you New Zealand. We see it in many of the Northern European countries as well. Here's a different way of looking at the data from Canada. This is graphing overall, how's your mental health? Very good would be 5, fairly good, excellent or very good or so-so. I forget what all 5 data response points are. But you can see the youngest age group, I think it's 15 to 30 on top, they used to be the happiest, and this is a universal pattern. It was called the U-shaped curve of happiness, that the happiest people were the youngest and the oldest. But look what happens when we get into this period. It's the 15 to 30-year-old women who used to be the happiest women in Canada, and now they're by far the least happy. And it happened in the blink of an eye. I should just point out the data for Canadian males is very similar. It's just that the changes aren't as dramatic. But all the trends are there for the men as well, but they're much extended for Canadian women. A bit more British data. A study of you had 2 giant studies where you tracked very large cohorts of kids born in 1991 roughly and born in 2001 roughly. Your Millennium Cohort Study, and what we find is that there was, if you look at the mental health problems that those 2 generations had, up through the age of 8, there's no difference. Here you can see it. Now here the x-axis is different than it was before. This is the age of the child. So whether you're in the millennial group or the Gen Z group, at the age of 5, there wasn't really any difference in the level of psychiatric problems. These are as reported by parents on a long questionnaire. But what happens after 8, as they say in the abstract, after 8 they diverge. Millennials didn't get more mentally ill as they got older. Gen Z gets more and more ill the older it gets, but only after 8. Why 8? Why does it start at 8? Well, in this country you have the distinction that, as far as I know, you have the highest rate of phone ownership among 5 to 7-year-olds. You have an astonishing rate, 24% according to a recent study by Ofcom. 24% of your 5 to 7-year-olds have their own smartphone. And this is what the graph of phone ownership looks like in your country. There you see the 24% up through age 8. And then this happens. You get to the point where almost all of your kids have a smartphone by the age of even 11. By the age of 11, you're up to over 80%. What that means is that in this country, it's not true in my country, but in this country, every British teenager is already on a phone and probably social media at the start of puberty. So your young people spend all of puberty in the virtual world. In America, we're close, but we're a couple years later, which is very important. Puberty is the most sensitive period of brain rewiring. It's the worst possible period to strap on the goggles and the headphones and have a never-ending stream of garbage being pumped in for the rest of your teen years. So I've been focusing on the mental health data because that's what's most dramatic. That's where the debate has been. That's the empirical argument that I've been most engaged in. But that's just one of about 10 different outcomes we need to track. It's probably the most important one. Number 2 is education. We all care about education. It's one of the things we talk most about in policy circles in your country and in mine. Recently in The Atlantic, Derek Thompson wrote an essay saying, it sure looks like the phones are making students dumber. There are 2 data sets that we can turn to. So in the United States, we have the National Assessment of Educational Progress, which we call the nation's report card. And what you see is that despite some really negative social trends, declining marriage, there's some difficult issues that are working against us. But even still, we have managed to raise what our kids actually know. Their academic attainment was from the 1971 at the beginning there, all the way up to 2012, we were making some steady progress in reading and math. And then what happens? Then it goes down. Now this gets lots of news because you can see the COVID effect. Keeping kids out of school was one of the most foolish things that we did in our countries, and boy did it hurt our kids. You can see that in the last segment. But notice, the decline began in 2012. It didn't begin with COVID. Our kids were already getting dumber before COVID. Of course they were. If you have a phone in your pocket and you're texting during class, how could you possibly learn as much as kids did in 2010? So the reversal began in 2012 in the United States. And Derek Thompson was writing because the PISA data had just come out. I'm sure you all know what PISA is. It's the global assessment of educational progress. And what you see here are, again, the scores on PISA up through 2010 were pretty stable in different topics. And then this happens. Once we get into the great rewiring period, 2010 to 2015 is when everything changes, and that's when scores began dropping around the world. So humanity is getting dumber at the exact moment when we most desperately need to figure out what the hell is happening to us. And it's not just, in school, it's not just about how much your kids learn. School is an incredibly important site for social development, or at least it used to be, because kids used to talk to each other. They used to interact. They used to play. What happens? Once everyone has a phone, as you heard in that introductory comment, once everyone has a phone, at every moment they've got to take out their phone because so much is going on. They have to know what's going on. So in between classes, they have to be on their phone. At lunch, they have to be on their phone. I'm exaggerating a little. Of course, they still do talk to each other. But compared to what it was in 2010, it's a different planet. This here, Jean Twenge and I found, a New Zealand friend showed us that buried in this huge long PISA survey on education, there were 6 items about loneliness at school. Things like I often feel lonely at school. Do you agree with that or disagree with it? So we average these 6 items together, and what you see is that this negative cluster of items, the scores were stable until 2010, 2012, and then after the 2012 administration, this happens. So it's not just that our kids aren't learning, it's that they're not connecting, and therefore they're lonelier in school. Why bother sending them to school if all they're going to be doing is be on their phones all day long? It's completely pointless and destructive. So why did this all happen around the world in 2012? The only theory on the table is this one. Everyone has a theory for why it happened in their own country. In America, people say, oh, you know, school shootings. We had our worst school shooting ever in 2012, and after that, the kids had lockdown drills, which are terrifying, stupid things we do to our children to terrify them. And so people say, well, that's why it's 2012. You know, okay, all right, that's an interesting theory. Why did that cause girls in New Zealand and Australia to start overdosing on their psychiatric medications at the exact same time? It just doesn't make any sense. So this is the only theory on the table. I've not even heard of another plausible candidate. If you have one, please give it in the discussion. So now I'll just skip through the remaining parts to get to the policy. So a large part of the story, which we're not covering today, is that this is not just about the phones coming in. This is about the loss of the thing kids need to do the most, which is play. All mammals play. That's how we wire up our brains. Kids are very playful. And so most of us in the room, if you're over 30, you had a play-based childhood. You spent a lot of time when you were a kid playing with your friends, unsupervised. That's how you learned to be self-supervising. We stopped all that in the 90s, in your country as in mine. You're not as insane as about fears of abduction and crime as we are. I mean, we have a higher crime rate than you do. But you all lost trust in each other just as we did. It is actually a pan-Anglo phenomena. In the 90s, we all lost trust in other adults. We began to be afraid that others will sexually abuse our children, and we began locking them up, not letting them play independently. So that's a big part of the story, and there are policy implications, but probably we'll see if we get to that. But that is half of the story. This is the one we're focusing on today, and this is the one that most people are interested in because the phones we feel we really can do something about. I'll just show you a couple slides from it. It's crucial to understand that the internet came in 2 very, very discrete waves. So the first wave was these paired technologies. This shows the percentage of American households that had each technology. And with technologies, there's usually a period of just a few years when everyone is getting it because everyone else is getting it. And so for computers, it was a little slower. Not everybody was getting those clunky old PCs in the early 1980s. But once the internet comes in the 90s, now it's more valuable. And so in the mid-90s, you see it's much steeper there. So this first wave was fantastic. Most of you in this room are old enough to remember when you first saw the internet. And it was as if God came to us and said, would you like to know everything instantly all over the world? And we're like, how is that possible? Like, how does a browser work? I mean, it was just unbelievable. So we were all wowed by it. The millennial generation grew up on it, and their mental health was fine. And many of them learned to program. Many of them learned to take apart computers. So we thought, this is great. Our kids are learning this technology, which is the wave of the future. And there was nothing to fear. And then the second wave came in. It's social media and the smartphone. And this begins in 2003 with Friendster and MySpace and then Facebook, but especially 2007 with the iPhone. And these are the technologies that have been adopted the fastest in human history. And that's when the switch was flipped. And that's when teen mental health collapsed all around the world, especially for girls. So what we did is we have rewired childhood. Childhood used to be more like this. This is on the top. You see a slide of actually kids somewhere in Britain playing in many decades ago. On the bottom, you see this is more like my childhood, riding around my hometown. You could just put an extraterrestrial in your basket and ride around. We just thought that was an okay thing for 10-year-olds to do. But we had adventures. My childhood was full of adventures, and not in school, but after school and on weekends. But now this is what childhood has become. If you're a boy, you have to go home alone. If you want to play with your friends, you cannot go to your friend's house. You have to go to your house so that you can put on your headset, your controller, your screen. Then you can play multiplayer video games, which are amazing, fun. So that's what our boys are doing. They're extremely lonely, but they are at least interacting on the screen. And the girls, of course, are spending much more time on social media, worrying about what people are thinking or saying or doing about them. The biggest change that this has caused, this complete transformation changes pretty much everything. Social development, sexual development, physical development, time outside, reading books, everything has changed. The biggest one to focus on is the loss of interaction with other children. So this is American data, time use data. What you see is that before 2012, Americans aged 15 to 24 spent by far the most time with their friends. All the other lines are for older people. Older people are married, they have kids, they're not hanging out with their buddies. But young people used to hang out with their buddies 2 hours a day, 120 minutes you see up there. And then this happens. Time with friends plunges. And I want to point out a really, I think, an unbelievable detail of this, which is the 2019 data collection from Americans about how they use every minute of their day. This is, by the way, this is time with friends outside of school. It's outside of school and work. What we see is that by 2019, that was the number. It was around 70 minutes a day. And now I'll show you what happened during COVID. The 2020 data was collected after COVID lockdowns. Can you see the COVID effect in those numbers? No, you can't. COVID lockdowns the trend just continued. It didn't even accelerate the trend. Gen Z began to socially distance the day we gave them a smartphone. The day we gave them a smartphone, it takes over their life, it sits in front of their face for the rest of their lives. They stop spending much time with other kids. And so they were already socially distanced by the time COVID arrived. The one, I've gotten only 2 points of pushback, really. One is by some researchers who claim that I don't understand the difference between correlation and causation, but that just means they haven't read my work because I've been writing about that. I've been gathering the correlational studies, longitudinal studies, the experimental studies, the quasi-experimental studies, the eyewitness testimony from each generation. So I've been very, very focused on showing that this is a causal effect. It's not just correlation. I want to put that out there because that's the main area when you see negative reviews of me or my work. That's it. The other point of pushback is just resignation. Trains left the station. What are we going to do? I guess we'll just give up on the future of humanity. And then to briefly go through this point, damage beyond mental health. I've already told you about education. I'm just going to show you the list of harms that I cover in the book. I have a section on each of these. Social deprivation, sleep deprivation, attention fragmentation, behavioral addiction. All of these are things that happen when kids shift their lives onto their phones instead of real life engagement with other human beings. These affect boys and girls equally. I have a whole chapter on the harms to girls. I just had to pick 6 because I couldn't make the chapter 1,000 pages long. So 6 major harms that happen to girls: visual social comparison, perfectionism, relational aggression. Girls share emotions more than boys, so they're more subject to emotional contagion. And girls are much more subject to sexual predation and harassment. Although, as we see in the sextortion scandal, most girls know not to send a naked photo to strangers, whereas most boys don't know that if a gorgeous, sexy girl asks you for a naked picture, it might not be a gorgeous, sexy girl. So boys are increasingly subject to extortion and a kind of sexual predation. I have a whole chapter on the story for boys, which is really interesting. It's a little different from the story for girls. The evidence linking social media to harm for boys is not as good as it is for girls. For boys, it's more just that they keep retreating from the real world because the virtual world gets more and more amazing. The video games, the pornography, soon the porn AI will be put in robots and sex dolls. They won't have any need to actually learn how to flirt, how to approach a girl or a woman. So the virtual world, the technology is allowing boys to achieve satisfaction without doing anything that could turn them into a man. So that's where we are. At least in my telling, this is the story that I'm laying out. I would welcome any challenges. If you think I've overstated things, exaggerated, missed some important nuances, I would welcome that. Now on to solutions. The key to the whole thing is the collective action problem. When I talk to young people, and there are surveys that show this, do they like their phone-based lives? No, they hate it. They do not like it. They are longing for the kind of childhood that their parents and grandparents had. So why don't you quit? Why don't you just put down your phone? Well, I can't because everyone else is on it. we are all trapped. The tech giants, they engineered it this way. They figured out how to hack into kids' concerns for their status. Everyone is on it because everyone else is on it. So the key to the collective action problem is to understand that. In a review of the book by Helen Rumbelow in the Times, she said that she liked the emphasis on the social dilemma, and she said, when I caught one of my teenagers between scrolls and asked her, would you have liked a social media ban until you were 16? She asked, would the ban affect everyone? And she paused to think. Yes, I'd have liked that, she said. It was an in-real-life moment that made me sadder than almost anything I'd read. Young people themselves hate what's going on. They're trapped. They want a way out. They're beginning to organize. Finally, we're beginning to see a number of Gen Z groups that are organizing to push back against what's happened to them. For this policy-oriented audience, I'll just be very explicit about what a collective action problem is. I'm sure all of you know the term, but you can graph it out this way. What's the benefit? If you're the first mover, if you're the first parent to say, no, I'm not giving you a smartphone. I'm going to give you a flip phone or a brick phone when you are out and about on your own without supervision, but I'm not giving you a smartphone until you're 16. If you're the only one, then you're now condemning your child to social isolation. It might be worth it. That's a tough call, but it's painful, very painful for your child. But what if a quarter of the families in your town are doing it? Now it's not nearly so painful because your child is not the only one. She has at least a few friends she can hang out with. And as it rises, then the benefit becomes enormous. So what I'm doing in the book, as an American, I just take it as an article of faith that my Congress will never do anything to help me. And so I wrote the whole book assuming we will get no help from government or leadership. Now in this country that's not true. You are the world leaders in coming up with thoughtful legislation to address this issue with the Age-Appropriate Design Code and the Online Safety Act. But I wrote the book assuming that if it's a collective action problem, we can solve it collectively, whether we have help from government or not. And so these are the 4 norms. No smartphones before, well, in America I say before high school, which for us is around age 14. But here, that's right in the middle of your secondary school. So British folks, and also same in Spain and other countries, are saying, no, let's make it the end of secondary school, which I think is right. No social media before 16, phone-free schools, and much more independence, free play, and responsibility in the real world. The revolution has begun in this country. Actually, Daisy, where are you? Where's Daisy? Oh, she was supposed to be here. Maybe she's not. Daisy Greenwell is one of the women who put up this WhatsApp group advocating to give their kids a smartphone-free childhood. And thousands of UK parents, within a day or two, thousands have signed up for it. So the movement, the grassroots movement has begun. That's how you solve a collective action problem, collectively. So here are 2 really good British organizations that are organizing parents and organizing the research. And finally, let's focus on what legislators and policymakers can do. And here, let me just see. Here, I'm going to focus on phone-free schools. There are policy implications for all 4 of the norms, and we could have a whole session just on what you could do to promote more free play, more independence. In fact, this might be a perfect topic for policy exchange, to commission a report on what has happened to playtime and it both in school and out. I think that would be very important to have. But let's focus on phone-free schools. As I was writing the book, Zach and we created all these Google Docs. We have like 30 or 40 Google Docs where we just put all the research we can find on different topics. And one of them is phone-free schools. So there's a link to this in this article that I'm about to show you. So here's part of the table of contents. We organize all the research we can find on policy options. What's the evidence that phones in school impact cognition and learning? Do smartphones impact social interaction? So this would, if anybody really wants to get into, actually I don't know whether you guys drew on this for the report. Where's Ian? I don't know. Did you go through that Google?
We did.
Oh, okay, great. So that was our hope was, let's just organize everything we can find and let's hope that people just use it. So that's great that you drew on it. I used that as the basis to write an article in The Atlantic with the simple title, Get Phones Out of Schools Now. That was about 10 months ago. And things are really moving. It's actually happening. And then we get this fantastic report just out today, this morning, from Policy Exchange that goes much more deeply into it, and it presents original research on what's actually happening in schools. Now, this is very important about the report, is that the research on do phone-free schools work There are some studies that find no effect, but the key is the great majority of schools say that they ban phones, but what they mean is you have to keep it in your pocket, which is like telling a heroin addict, welcome to our treatment clinic. Oh, sure, you can bring in your heroin and your needles, but keep it in your pocket. You're not allowed to shoot up in the clinic. And so, some teachers have told me, kids go to the bathroom a lot more now than they used to. The point is, if you have an effective ban, which is you separate the child from the phone, or at least you put it in a phone locker, I think is the best. Lockable pouches is easier in some ways. Those are the two real solutions. If you do that, then, as they find in the report, you get results. You get clear results. Again, it's all correlational at this point, but that would be the next step is I think, to do some experiments. So that's my presentation to you. I've told you that we are going through a tragedy in 2 acts, but the 3rd act is just beginning. And that is the response, which is effective phone bans are the one big thing we can do right now. This is what we're in April. We're still in April. We can do this by September. We can make all of our schools phone free by September. So that, I think, is the beginning of Act 3. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, we haven't got very much time, so I'll try and keep this short, but I'm sure there is one question that everybody would like me to ask, which is, what, if any, response have you had from the tech companies? I mean, if this was a Hollywood movie, you would die in a mysterious car accident on your way back to Heathrow.
That has actually crossed my mind, because the response from tech companies above the surface has been zero, nothing whatsoever. In 2020, just before COVID hit, I had meetings at Google and Meta. I know some people there. I talked with Mark Zuckerberg, Nick Clegg. So I have cordial relations with the individuals. They've done nothing overt to harm me or to attack me. But there are a number of researchers. Look, a lot of research is funded by them. There are a lot of internet research agencies and places, and of course, I mean, they have salaries to pay. They have to raise money. I don't know. I don't know, what effect that is having. But if it's the tobacco playbook, we would expect that they're funding research to try to muddy the waters, to spread the idea that the science is unsettled.
You did have some exchanges with Zuckerberg over age verification a few years ago, didn't you? But
yes.
You haven't. That's not been followed up on.
No, that's right. He told me they're working on it. When I first raised it with him, he said, "But we don't allow people under 13 on our platform." Mark, my kids are 11. When they hit 11 years old, middle school, they said everyone's on Instagram. He said we're working on it, and that was in 2020.
Okay, let me just return to the critique briefly. I mean, you've been very open about all the research you've done. You've engaged with your critics very openly, sort of a model in some ways of a social scientific debate. But I want to put the critiques in 2 broad camps. I mean, the first one that says you're basically exaggerating the extent of the mental health crisis. Yes, some kids are very badly affected by the phone life, but most of what we're talking about is relatively mild depression and anxiety, the so-called common mental disorders. And actually, if you look at the UK anyway, the harder data on self-harm hospitalisation, it did go up quite dramatically, 40% I think between 2012 2022 for girls and young women. It's actually now gone all the way back down, thankfully.
All the way back down?
Yeah, all the way back down to the 2012 level.
Oh, I'd be very surprised if that was true. I'd love to see that. I haven't ever seen a reversal.
I'll show that to you. But, and I mean, suicide, again, for young women has gone up from 1.4 per 100,000 to 3. I mean, it's sort of doubled. But
that sounds really bad to me.
Yeah, but the absolute numbers, it's gone up from like 80 to 160. Everyone is a tragedy, but this is not proof of anything. Okay, so there's that. The second cluster of critique is the other causes. Do you focus too much on on the social media and the phones. Now, obviously, part
Obviously.
of your thesis is that it's parenting as well, and it's the so you know there's one answer to that. But one thing that actually I haven't seen very much among your critics is the extraordinary changes to family life.
Yeah.
Nearly half of British children born this century do not live with both of their biological parents by the time they're 16. Surely this, as a sort of background factor, this must also be a huge contributor.
Okay, let me start with the mental health issues. So, we have active debates about whether did it really go up by 150%, or is part of that a changing diagnostic criteria? We've engaged with the critics. They say it was all changing diagnostic criteria. There was a big one in 2015. So we say, okay, but why is the discontinuity at 2012, not 2015? The ICD had changed its definitions of depression. That's the only thing that could explain a global, if the increase was an artifact. The null hypothesis is the kids are all right, just changing definitions, there's no problem. The arguments I've seen about what could explain this on a global level don't match the timing. That would be 2015, and there isn't a discontinuity in 2015, it's 2012. So I think this is real. Also, to be a skeptic now, so I'm calling the people who say there's nothing going on, there's no link to social media, we call them skeptics. Me and Jean Twenge, we call alarm ringers. The skeptics think we're alarmists, and if we're wrong, then we are alarmists. But if it really is a crisis, then we are alarm ringers. To be a skeptic now means that you are so sure that the data is capturing everything, that you think all of those heads of school who say that mental health is their top problem, they're all wrong. They're all mistaking correlation for causation. You think all the psychiatrists and psychologists, they're all wrong. You think all the parents whose kids got on social media and were sextorted and then killed themselves the next day, that's just correlation. You can't prove causation. So the idea that this is a figment of our imagination, it's a phantasmagoria created by shifting standards, I think is just, at this point, nonsensical. Maybe some things overstate by 20%, but, so that's that. As for the other causes, the other charge I get is people say, oh, Haidt's oversimplifying, it's not just social media. Yeah, I wrote a whole book on how it's not just social media. It's a complicated story that goes deep into development, starts in early childhood, and involves the loss of play, and so once you understand that there are two parts of the story, we have overprotected our children in the real world, we have underprotected them online. Let's look at both of those, and now we can talk about the other things that supposedly contribute. None of the theories I've seen fit the data. Jean Twenge has a post. Here are 13 other explanations for the teen mental health crisis. None of them work. The ones you mention are important. They cannot explain why it was 2012. Really suddenly, that's when everyone stopped getting married, was 2012? So none of them can explain this light switch that turned on in 2012. The loss of marriage provides stability. Stability is extraordinarily important for childhood development. The other thing that I think is quite important is siblings. When I was growing up, almost every family had 2 to 4 children. Now it's one or maybe 2. So it used to be there were kids around. So if you were an only child, you still had kids to play with. But now if you're an only child, you're spending a lot of time alone on a screen. So yes, there are other things that matter. But if we're going to focus, but my question is, why did it start around the world at the same time? And can you come up with any? Seriously, can you come up with any other explanation?
Okay, well let's let me just move on to the implementation. Your 4 points. Banning.
Please don't say. But you Brits, you always
Sorry,
want to ban
okay,
things.
Yeah. Okay.
We want a social norm that you don't give a kid a smartphone.
So what do we say instead of banning?
No smartphones till 16.
That sounds a bit like banning.
No. Banning means a law. If the government is going to say you're not allowed to give your child a smartphone, or maybe we'll put you in jail, not jail, but that's a ban. What I'm after is a norm.
All right. Okay, limiting access to smartphone before 16, limiting access to social media before 16, school ban, where I think it really is.
You got to use phone-free schools. Phone-free.
Access to phone in school harder.
Yeah. Fine.
And the fourth one, the
more independence, free play, and responsibility in the real world.
Okay, the first two, the fourth, I think has wide agreement. The third, almost unanimous agreement,
Yes.
I suspect. The first two are obviously more controversial.
True.
And I just want to read you something written by a guy called Peter Wanless, who's chief executive of the National Society for the Protection of Cruelty to Children. And he makes this point.
I hope the prevention of cruelty to children.
What did I say?
Protection.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah, okay, good. Just making sure. I thought it was a weird transatlantic difference.
More cruelty for children,
Yes.
please. Okay. A blanket ban on smartphones or social media for everyone under 16 is an unnecessarily blunt proposal. It would punish young people for the failures of tech companies to properly embed child safety into the services they design. It would take away any imperative for them to fix the problem they've created. We'd be letting them off the hook. What do you say to that?
Well, what I say to that is it's interesting. I study moral psychology, and it's interesting. People bring their existing concerns to any policy question. And if you already are mad at the tech companies for creating this, you're not going to want anything that gets them off the hook. Fine, that's a reasonable argument. And I can see that there's some validity to that. But if our kids' mental health is falling off a cliff, I want to solve it as quickly as possible. We're not going to get the tech companies to do it voluntarily. I do want legislation to force them to take some responsibility, as you do in the age-appropriate design code. But at a deeper level, what that comment shows is the standard response to media issues over the last 100 years, which is it's all about the content. Television, comes in, everyone's concerned about sex and violence on TV. How can our kids are going to be watching 10 hours of television a day, how can we make that 10 hours less toxic? Okay, I suppose it would be nice to make it less toxic, but how about they don't watch television for 10 hours a day? How about we work on that? As Marshall McLuhan said, the medium is the message. And he said, don't focus on what's on TV. Focus on how the conversion to a TV watching society changed so much about our cognition and our lives. Same thing here. What I'm after, people assume that I want to ban things and that I'm focused on what people are saying and I want to regulate what people are saying. No, I'm a big free speech advocate in the United States. I never talk about content moderation. I'm talking about structural and architectural features of the platforms that were designed to grab our children's attention, hold on to it, and never let go. This is content neutral, politically neutral. This is about what they did, the designs of their products that are unsafe for children, and they get off scot-free. In America, we have a law that says there are two industries you can't sue if they kill your child: gun makers and social media. Anyone else you can sue if they kill your child, not those two. Congress has a special exemption for them. So I'm hoping that you can do the right thing in the UK.
Yeah, you're quite complimentary about the UK. I mean, people here are rather sceptical about the Online Safety Act, but you seem to have some good things to say about it, and you think that we're actually in a better position. I mean, despite the fact that our children, as you just showed, are kind of more exposed to it, but that we're somehow in a better position to do something about it. Just explain that.
Sure. Well, so first, here's my working assumption. So the Chinese are approaching this in their way, which is authoritarian. They simply say, we're cutting off the internet, we're cutting off TikTok, and we're making TikTok safe for our kids. That's the Chinese way. It's not open to us in liberal democracies. The Europeans, my prejudice as an American is the Europeans, they just love to regulate. They don't care that they have a completely non-dynamic dying society. That's not necessarily the best way to go. In America, we're a little too libertarian. We're too unable to regulate. We have a vetocracy. We can't get things done if anyone objects. So I'm thinking of Britain as sort of like the porridge that was just the right temperature, where I'm hopeful that you're a smaller society, you have a functioning legislature, you have a basically Anglo sensibility. Well, of course you invented it, but so I'm hopeful that you'll work. Now, I could be wrong about the age-appropriate design code. I'm friends with Biban Kidron. Maybe I'm biased because of that. The devil is in the details, and so you tell me. I'd love to know. I don't know that the details are working out great. I just don't know. You tell me. What's the big problem?
I think the answer is it's too early to tell.
Okay.
But other people here know more about this than I. Just a final point before I bring in the audience. One anxiety I think a lot of people have is that if this is successful or partially successful, it's likely to be. There's going to be a kind of anywhere, somewhere divide, to use my language. That actually it's going to be it's going to be our kids who are not going to be on their phones, but the people in the bottom half of the income spectrum, the children and the single parents, are still going to be zombies. How do we avoid that?
Well, you're right that there will definitely be an inequality enhancing component here. It's the parents who are more educated, more likely to be married, have the resources. You're right. The reform is going to start with the wealthier, more educated families. On the first 2 points. On the third point is phone-free schools. If we do phone-free schools, given that kids from low-income families and from single-parent families, they spend about an hour or two a day. In the U.S., it's 1 or 2 hours a day more on their phones than do kids with married parents or kids from a higher social class. So phone-free schools is an equity-enhancing solution. Phone-free schools give all the kids 6 or 7 hours a day away from their phones. They're not going to get that at home. They're not going to get that on weekends. But at least 6 hours a day, 5 days a week, the benefit will go even more to the kids in lower class families and with single parent families than it will to the upper class kids.
Okay, look, we've only got about 10 minutes or so, but let's have a few points and questions, relatively quick if possible. Yeah, go on. That fella, I know him.
Does anyone have a disagreement or critique? I'm a big fan of John Stuart Mill. I find that if you ask people to make you smarter by telling you where they're wrong, they will do that. So could you raise your hand if you have a critique? Just I hope you'll call on somebody for the next question with a critique.
Yeah, okay. Yeah. You go first.
Yeah, not a million point or critique.
Tell everybody who you are first.
I'm Daniel Hannon. I'm a Conservative working there.
Daniel, good to see you.
Nice to see you. I wanted to ask you actually about what you have found about the impact of phones on over 16s. What's been the impact on their cognition, their psychology, how do they relate to each other, and on something that you've both written about, the tribalism and the politics and so on. How does that pan out?
Okay.
Yeah.
Let's take two or three. Helen, there. You're a critic. Yeah.
Helen Joyce, I'm the author of Trans, When Ideology Met Reality. I think you and the other people who talk about this pay too little attention, if I may, to the content of what children see when they're unsupervised, when they're doing peer-to-peer stuff. It's not just about the bullying and the lack of play, it's that they teach each other absolute nonsense.
Yes.
They tell each other nonsense about mental health, and they tell each other nonsense about identity. And a big part of what Lisa Littman identified when she said rapid onset gender dysphoria was children teaching each other nonsense about what it is to be a sexed human being. So I haven't seen that properly critiqued or properly explained anywhere, how they're basically living in virtual Lord of the Fly Islands, where they just go off and, create nonsense and rubbish society.
Sure. Okay, a couple more. The guy in the front row.
Let's just do one. I can't hold it. I'm 60 years old. My memory's declining. Just do one more.
Okay, well, just one more then. All right, yeah. Well, the last one was a comment rather than a question.
Hi, Angus Walker, former journalist. I work for a PR company that works with a lot of schools. This is a critique as well. What do you say to those who... I was based on a conversation with my mum, who was saying, well, in my day it was get your nose out of that book. Then it was if you watch too much TV, you'll go square-eyed. What do you say to those who say it's just another cultural scare in a series of many over the generations? And have you measured the damage that continues into adulthood?
Great. Okay, so let me start with that one, which is, that's a very reasonable critique to say, yeah, we've been here before over and over again. In the 18th century, it was novels were supposed to excite young women's passion, so don't let them read novels. So that's a perfectly good null hypothesis, that the kids are all right, and this is just another one. And it's up to me, the burden of proof is on me to say this time is different. Well, this time is really, really different for these reasons. First, in a traditional moral panic, there are sensational stories trumped up by scurrilous news organizations about a kid who read a comic book and axe murdered his parents. Maybe it happened, maybe it never happened. That's what you see in a traditional moral panic. This time, everyone knows someone whose kid is cutting herself, who attempted suicide. Everyone knows someone. That's why I think the book is spreading like wildfire, because this is not a traditional moral panic. This is something we all have seen in our own families. Another difference is that in the past, you didn't have, if you didn't have kids organizing to ban comic books, and now you do. You have Gen Z. I can't find a Gen Z organization that's in favor of the phones. There's no one saying, adults, back off, we love our phones. There are Gen Z organizations saying, let's delay, let's wait, let's make it less toxic. So this is very different from any previous moral panic. Now, as for the question about what do we do for older kids, my book really did focus on, especially on sort of puberty and teen years. That's what I did focus on. I have a little bit on early. I don't have much on later. I need to. And it's in part because I've taught a class at NYU Stern for many years for MBA students, an older class called Work, Wisdom, Happiness, But because of the mental health crisis that we have everywhere, I changed my course around to make an undergrad course, and I only began teaching it 1.5 years ago, 2 years ago. And with these undergrads, they're 19 years old, we get remarkable results when we return their attention to them. Because the key fact about Gen Z is that they have given away all of their attention. They don't own any mental capacity to really do anything. And because they get 300 notifications a day, they've got 5 platforms to keep up with, they really don't have any time to think or do anything productive. So when you get control of that, when you say turn off all your notifications except for 5 apps, when I say get social media off of your phone, if you absolutely need it, you can use it on your laptop, ideally just on weekends. But try to not give it 15 hours of your week. Try to just give it 1. They do that and they get remarkable results. They regain control over their consciousness. They find that they have actually now time to do their homework and play the guitar or go out with a friend. So in part, we have to look at what puberty is doing to the brains, but we also have to look at the habits that Gen Z has developed, which can be changed, and you get remarkable results when you change the habits.
Okay, just very quick ones. We're going to take one just to show that the technology works. We're going to take one from someone who's online. Zoe Strimple, can you hear me?
I'm going to unmute. Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you. Speak up.
I have to warn you that speaking of children, a baby might cry at any point. So thank you. That was. I agree broadly, of course, with everything, and it's good to see such rigorous data. I guess the first thing I just want to say is a little comment, which is this use of the word dumber as a way of describing children doing less well on standardized tests. I sort of take issue with that, because I think if we start telling kids they're actually stupid because they're not performing well in academic or kind of standardized tests, I think that's a kind of pretty sad way of looking at intelligence, and is kind of demoralizing, which leads to my next question, which is there also perhaps not a causation, but a correlation with schools adopting a much more sort of automated, tick box style of, tech mediated evaluation around 2012. I don't know, but I do hear from parents whose children are further along that the children are subject to kind of endless amounts of monitoring and evaluation, and even GCSEs are this kind of insanely complicated gamut. That's the high school, the 15-year-old exams here. So is it possible that children are not only doing all these things in their own life, but are suffering from the most boring schooling of all time that is also quite dehumanizing?
Okay, thanks, Zoe.
Okay.
Let's take a couple more. Amanda.
Amanda Spielman, former Chief Inspector of the School Inspectorate. It's a comment and a question. I think it's been systematic undervaluing of some really important aspects of schools, and in particular, the very clever mechanism they are to create a social, to use the human interactions between teachers and pupils and between pupils, both to create motivation, to avoid distraction, and to promote social development. This has been systematically disparaged as a sort of 19th century factory model over and over again, particularly by tech companies and their agendas. And there's a very powerful wider digital agenda. Digital by default is the sort of government buzzword. And digital equity becomes an end in itself. I've just reframed a panel discussion I'm part of next week to say that's not a good end to define as an end. So I think a much stronger conception of what a school is and what its power comes from is needed. And I'm interested in how you think we can get to a better framing of schools.
Can I respond to the combined? So very, very briefly, thank you for that comment, Zoe and Amanda, I think it was. Yes, I said dumber for effect with an audience. I should be more careful with that. You're right. As for the educational technology, that's the next place I'm going to look, because you're right. When the kids got iPhones, the schools were flooded with free iPads and Chromebooks because the Apple world and the Google world were competing to get the kids in the schools hooked on their products. And I cannot imagine a larger change in education that was done with zero research, zero reason to think that it was beneficial. Back then, we were mostly techno-optimists. We thought, the more technology the kids have, the better they'll be prepared for the future. Well, now it's clear that this is not true. And we should have been aware of the fact that even then in 2012, Steve Jobs and all the other tech moguls, they sent their kids to the Waldorf school where there's zero technology. They did not let their kids have this stuff. Drug dealers do not give crack to their own children. They sell it to us and our children. So yes, I need to look there. There's a UNESCO report last year that seems to say that there's no evidence any of this stuff is helping. It's probably hurting. The key is the technology such that the kid can access the internet or send or receive text? If so, it's almost guaranteed to be so distracting that it negates any possible benefit.
Let's squeeze in just two final quick ones. Pamela in the front row, and Jess in pink. Just tell us who you are.
Pamela Guy from Civic Future. And sorry if this is in the book, but can we know from your work if parents having smartphones, so Gen Z hitting puberty with negligent zombie parents is a factor? And if so, do we need a fifth norm that stops parents?
Thank you.
Actually, no, not Jess. You're not, because you have an opportunity later. Polka dot woman. Are you still?
Thank you. Yeah.
Okay.
Polka dot woman. Sophie Gunter. Hello. I'm working with a food behavioural change program, and I'd just love you to talk a little bit about obesity and the prevalence of sugar and processed foods and that change in diet, which seems to be correlating to exactly this time. So I'm completely agreeing with what you say, but I think that food, nutrition, diet has also plummeted in its benefits at the same time. So I think there's a correlation.
You're right. So we keep one of our Google documents is called alternative explanations. And we have, declining sperm count, declining testosterone count, increasing junk food, plastics. We have all sorts of possible things. And what we're especially looking for, all these things are bad, but can any of them explain why things were stable for 10 or 15 years, and then in 2012, everything changes? So I don't think the junk food can do that. On the other hand, there's a report from Sapiens Lab, which I've worked with, where they find that basically a linear relationship, the more junk food you consume, the more depressed you are. They find pretty clear relations. I think food is a big part of it. The sedentary lifestyle also deprives kids of mobility, exercise, time outside, and at least for boys on video games, they eat more junk food. So I think that is a piece of the puzzle, I do agree. As for what about younger kids and parents, absolutely, and I need to stress that a lot more. Many people say, well, if parents are on their phones, of course the kids are copying them, to which I say, no. The kids care what everyone else in their peer group thinks. They're not copying you. They're copying. So the issue is not that you're on your phone and if you magically get off, your kids will get off. That's not going to happen. Where it really matters is 0 to 2, and especially 0 to 1. 0 to 1, it's like the brain is just beginning to wake up, and it's the back and forth. It's the eye gaze. It's the synchrony, the synchronous interaction. That is so vital for infants. And if most of us are doing, because we're all so busy because of our phones, we have so much stuff coming in, we're all doing continuous partial attention. Like, yes, sweetie, that's adorable. Oh, yes, the dragon. We're all doing that stuff because we're busy. I think it really hurts the infants. So again, I don't have the proof, that's not my expertise, but I do think, and I should say more about that, what we do affects our kids in a variety of ways. Thank you.
I'm afraid that is it, everybody. Thank you very much, Jonathan. There are copies of the book at the back.